Captain Sarah Chen stared at the holographic display floating above her command console, her dark eyes reflecting the crimson warnings that pulsed across the bridge of the UES Defiance. The massive battleship shuddered as another wave of energy struck its shields, sending sparks cascading from damaged control panels. "Captain, we're receiving distress signals from 17 different sectors," Lieutenant Rodriguez called out from the communication station, his voice barely audible over the alarm klaxons. The Andromedans, the Zephyrians, even the Crystalline Collective are all reporting the same thing. Sarah's jaw tightened. In her 15 years of service with the United Earth Navy, she had never seen anything like this. The galaxy's most powerful civilizations, races that had dominated space for millennia, were crying out for help. These weren't primitive species begging for assistance. These were the same aliens who had once dismissed humanity as nothing more than violent apes who had barely learned to travel between stars. "What exactly are they reporting?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Total system failures, Captain. Entire fleets going dark. Some are calling it the Void Plague, others are naming it the Silent Death. Whatever it is, it's moving fast and leaving nothing behind." Dr. Marcus Webb, the ship's chief science officer, looked up from his research terminal with a pale face. The elderly scientist had studied xenobiology for over 30 years, but the data streaming across his screen seemed to shake him to his core. "Captain, I've been analyzing the reports from the affected systems," Webb said, his voice trembling slightly. "This isn't a conventional weapon or any form of technology we understand. The energy signatures suggest something that operates outside our known laws of physics. Ships, stations, even entire planets are simply ceasing to exist." Sarah walked over to the main viewport and gazed out at the swirling nebula that surrounded their current position. The Defiance was part of a small human patrol fleet that had been conducting routine border surveys when the first distress calls began arriving. Now they were possibly the only military force still operational in this sector. "Sir, incoming transmission from Admiral Harrison at Earth Command," Communications Officer Kim announced. "Put him through." The holographic image of Admiral James Harrison materialized in the center of the bridge. The old man's face was grim, and Sarah could see the weight of command pressing down on his shoulders like a physical burden. "Captain Chen, I'm sure you've been monitoring the situation," Harrison began without preamble. "As of 1600 hours Earth Standard Time, we've lost contact with 43 star systems. The Galactic Council is in complete disarray. The Andromedans have withdrawn their entire fleet to their home system. The Zephyrians are talking about retreating to another galaxy entirely." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. The Andromedans were considered the most technologically advanced race in known space. If they were running scared, then whatever humanity was facing was truly beyond comprehension. "What are your orders, Admiral?" Sarah asked. "You're to proceed to the Kepler 442 system immediately. We've received fragmentary transmissions suggesting that whatever this threat is, it's heading directly toward the core worlds, Earth included." The bridge fell silent except for the steady hum of the ship's engines. Every member of the crew understood the implications. Earth, humanity's birth world and the center of their small but growing interstellar civilization, was directly in the path of an enemy that had already destroyed civilizations far more advanced than their own. "Admiral, with respect, what can one battleship do against something that's wiping out entire fleets?" Sarah asked. Harrison's expression softened slightly, and for a moment, Sarah saw not the commanding officer but the old family friend who had encouraged her to join the Navy years ago. "Sarah, I've been studying the preliminary reports, and there's something strange about this phenomenon. It seems to be specifically targeting advanced technological civilizations. The more sophisticated the technology, the faster and more complete the destruction. But there are reports of primitive worlds being completely ignored, even when they're in the same system as destroyed colonies." Dr. Webb suddenly looked up from his console, his eyes wide with understanding. "Captain, that could mean that our relative technological simplicity might actually be an advantage. Compared to races like the Andromedans or the Crystalline Collective, human technology is still fairly basic. We use brute force solutions where they use elegant energy manipulation. We rely on solid matter constructions while they use exotic matter and dimensional folding." Sarah felt a spark of hope ignite in her chest. Throughout human history, their species had survived by being adaptable, resourceful, and too stubborn to know when they were beaten. Perhaps those same qualities that had made them seem primitive to the galactic community might now be their salvation. Set course for Kepler 442, maximum burn, Sarah ordered, and send a message to all human vessels in the area. Tell them to converge on our position. As the Defiance turned toward its destination, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were about to face something that would test not just humanity's military might, but their very understanding of existence itself. The galaxy's ultimate nightmare was coming, and somehow, the youngest and most primitive spacefaring race would have to stand against it. The ship jumped to hyperspace, leaving behind the relative safety of the outer rim and heading toward whatever cosmic horror awaited them in the depths of space. Sarah stood at the viewport, watching the stars stretch into lines of light, and wondered if she was leading her crew toward their destruction or toward humanity's greatest triumph. Behind her, the crew worked with quiet determination, each person knowing that the fate of not just humanity, but possibly all life in the galaxy, might depend on what they discovered in the days ahead. The ultimate test was coming, and ready or not, humanity would have to face it head-on. The Kepler 442 system was supposed to be empty. According to all stellar cartography databases, it contained nothing but a dying red dwarf star and 3 barren rock planets. Yet as the UES Defiance dropped out of hyperspace, Captain Sarah Chen found herself staring at something that defied all logic and understanding. "Captain, sensors are detecting massive energy readings throughout the system," Tactical Officer Reynolds reported, his voice filled with confusion. "But I'm not reading any ships, stations, or artificial structures." Sarah moved to the main sensor display, studying the readings that painted an impossible picture. Energy signatures were scattered across the system like breadcrumbs, each one indicating the presence of something that their instruments couldn't properly identify. "Dr. Webb, what are you seeing?" Sarah asked. The science officer was hunched over his console, his fingers dancing across holographic controls as he tried to make sense of the data. "It's unlike anything in our databases, Captain. The energy patterns are consistent with matter displacement on a massive scale, but there's no source for the energy expenditure. It's as if reality itself is being rewritten in discrete locations throughout the system." Lieutenant Rodriguez suddenly straightened at his communications post. "Captain, I'm picking up a transmission. It's weak and heavily distorted, but it appears to be coming from the 3rd planet. Put it through." The bridge speakers crackled with static before a voice emerged, speaking in heavily accented galactic standard. "This is Commander Voss of the Andromedan research vessel Infinite Wisdom. If anyone receives this transmission, do not approach the system. We have encountered the source of the galactic destructions. It is not what we thought. Repeat, it is not what any of us thought." The transmission cut to static, then resumed. "The entity is not destroying civilizations through conventional means. It is consuming the concept of advanced technology itself. Our quantum computers simply forgot how to function. Our fusion reactors became incapable of maintaining containment. The more sophisticated our systems, the faster they degraded into inert matter." Sarah felt her blood run cold. She had dealt with many threats during her career, but the idea of an enemy that could make technology itself cease to function was beyond terrifying. "But there is hope," the voice continued. "We observed a human cargo vessel pass through the affected area with minimal damage. Their primitive fusion drive continued to operate when our most advanced propulsion systems failed completely. The entity seems unable to properly perceive or affect less sophisticated technology." Dr. Webb looked up from his console with wide eyes. "Captain, that explains everything. The reports we've been receiving about primitive worlds being ignored. The pattern of destruction affecting the most advanced civilizations first. This entity operates on a level where technological sophistication is not an advantage, but a vulnerability." "Can we reach the Andromedan ship?" Sarah asked. "Negative, Captain," Reynolds replied. "The energy readings suggest their vessel is no longer functional. The life signs are weak but present, which means their crew is probably stranded on the planet's surface." Sarah made a decision that would have been unthinkable just days ago. The Andromedans had always treated humanity with barely concealed contempt, viewing them as upstart primitives who had no business among the stars. Yet now, those same primitives might be the galaxy's only hope. Take us into the system, but keep us at minimum power. Switch to backup systems wherever possible. I want our technology footprint as small as possible." The Defiance moved slowly through the system, her crew watching the sensor displays with growing amazement and horror. As they approached the 3rd planet, they began to see the evidence of the entity's power. Floating in space were the twisted remains of what had once been sophisticated Andromedan technology, now reduced to inert metal and exotic materials that no longer remembered their original purpose. "Captain, I'm detecting life signs on the planet's surface," Dr. Webb reported. "Approximately 30 individuals, likely the Andromedan research team. Their shelter appears to be constructed from primitive materials, probably salvaged from their ship's non-electronic components." "Prepare a landing party," Sarah ordered. "Commander Jackson, select a team with the most basic equipment possible. No advanced scanners, no quantum communication devices. If this entity targets sophisticated technology, then we go down there with technology so primitive it won't even notice us." Commander Jackson, the ship's Marine leader, nodded grimly. He was a veteran of multiple conflicts and understood the value of adapting tactics to meet unusual threats. "Kinetic weapons, basic atmospheric suits and chemical-powered communications only," Jackson confirmed. "We'll be going in practically Stone Age by galactic standards." As the landing party prepared, Sarah couldn't help but reflect on the irony of the situation. Humanity had spent decades trying to prove themselves worthy of respect among the galactic community, desperately working to advance their technology to match that of older civilizations. Now their perceived weakness might be their greatest strength. The shuttle launched from the Defiance's bay, its simple chemical engines providing thrust in a way that had remained unchanged for over a century. As they descended through the planet's atmosphere, Sarah watched through the viewport as the surface revealed the full scope of the disaster. Scattered across the landscape were the remains of the Andromedan research facility. Advanced structures that had once defied gravity now lay collapsed, their anti-gravity generators having simply forgotten how to manipulate space-time. Vehicles that had moved through dimensional folds were now motionless sculptures of exotic alloys. Yet among the wreckage, she could see signs of survival. Crude shelters built from basic materials, fires burning in simple metal containers, and small figures moving about with the purposeful activity of people determined to survive against impossible odds. "Take us down near the largest shelter," Sarah instructed the pilot. "And remember, everyone stays calm. We're not just making first contact with survivors. We're potentially making contact with the key to understanding our enemy." As the shuttle touched down on the alien world's surface, Sarah prepared to meet with beings who had once considered her species beneath notice. Now the tables had turned in the most unexpected way possible. The galaxy's most advanced race needed help from its most primitive spacefarers, and the fate of all civilization might depend on how well humans could prove that sometimes simple solutions were the most effective ones. The shuttle's hatch opened, and Captain Sarah Chen stepped onto the surface of an alien world, ready to face whatever came next in humanity's most crucial test. The Andromedan who emerged from the makeshift shelter bore little resemblance to the proud, technologically superior beings that humanity had always known. Commander Voss was tall and slender, as all Andromedans were, but his usually pristine biomechanical suit was torn and stained. His elongated head, typically crowned with neural interface ports, now showed crude bandages where delicate cybernetic implants had once connected him to his ship's systems. "I must confess," Voss said in perfect but heavily accented English, "when I transmitted that distress call, I never expected humans to be the ones who answered." Captain Sarah Chen studied the alien commander carefully. Despite his obvious distress, Voss maintained the formal bearing that characterized his species. However, there was something different in his large, multifaceted eyes. The usual condescension was gone, replaced by something Sarah had never seen from an Andromedan before: genuine respect. "Commander Voss," Sarah replied with a slight nod, "we received your transmission. Can you tell us exactly what happened here?" Voss gestured toward the wreckage that surrounded them. What had once been a sophisticated research facility, capable of manipulating matter at the quantum level, was now nothing more than twisted metal and inert exotic materials. "We came here to investigate reports of spatial anomalies in this system," Voss explained. "Our sensors detected massive energy displacements, but we could find no source." Then it appeared. "It?" Dr. Webb asked, his scientific curiosity overriding diplomatic protocol. "The entity defies description in any language I know," Voss continued. "It was not a ship or a construct in any sense we understand. Imagine if the concept of entropy itself became self-aware and decided to walk among the stars. It simply existed in our reality, and by existing it began to unmake everything around it that exhibited what it perceived as excessive complexity. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. Throughout human history, their species had faced many threats, but they had always been tangible enemies that could be fought with conventional weapons and tactics. "How did you survive?" Commander Jackson asked. "By abandoning everything that made us who we were," Voss replied with bitter irony. "Our neural implants failed first, cutting us off from our ship's systems. Our quantum computers became inert. Our fusion reactors forgot how to maintain plasma containment. Within minutes, we were reduced to using fire for warmth and crude tools for construction." Dr. Webb was frantically taking notes on a simple paper notebook, having abandoned his electronic devices on the shuttle. "Commander Voss, you mentioned that the entity seemed unable to affect less sophisticated technology. Can you elaborate on that?" Voss nodded toward a crude shelter where several other Andromedans were working. "Observe my people, Doctor. They are using knives made from simple steel alloys, fires contained in basic metal bowls, and tools that would not have been out of place on your Earth 1,000 years ago. Yet these primitive implements continue to function perfectly. The entity appears to have difficulty perceiving or affecting technology below a certain threshold of complexity." Sarah began to understand the implications. Throughout the galaxy, the most advanced civilizations had spent millennia developing increasingly sophisticated technology, believing that greater complexity meant greater power. Now that very sophistication had become their greatest vulnerability. "Commander, do you know where the entity went after it finished here?" Sarah asked. Voss's expression darkened. It moved toward the galactic core, following what appeared to be a systematic pattern. "Our last long-range sensors detected it approaching the Zephyrian home system before all our equipment failed. If the pattern holds, it will eventually reach Earth." The human landing party exchanged glances. Earth's technology was primitive by galactic standards, but it was still far more advanced than fire and steel tools. "There is something else," Voss continued, "something that may be crucial to your survival. During our brief encounter with the entity, our xenopsychologists observed its behavior patterns. It does not appear to be malicious in any way we understand. It simply exists, and its existence is incompatible with complex technology." Dr. Webb looked up from his notes. "Like an immune system responding to foreign bodies." "An excellent analogy," Voss agreed. "The entity seems to view advanced technology as a form of infection that must be cleansed from reality. It cannot comprehend the difference between a quantum computer and a virus that threatens the fundamental structure of existence." Sarah began to pace, her mind racing through the tactical implications. If the entity moves in a predictable pattern and takes time to completely cleanse each system, then we might have a chance to evacuate civilian populations to systems with minimal technological infrastructure. "Captain," Commander Jackson interjected, "even if we evacuate everyone, we're talking about the complete collapse of galactic civilization. Billions of beings reduced to pre-industrial survival. Better than extinction," Sarah replied grimly. Voss stepped forward, his tall frame casting a long shadow in the alien sun. "Captain Chen, there may be another option. Before our equipment failed, we managed to gather some data about the entity's structure and behavior. It appears to exist partially in normal space and partially in what your scientists call hyperspace. The connection between these dimensional states seems to be its primary vulnerability." Dr. Webb's eyes lit up with understanding. "If we could somehow disrupt that connection, we might be able to force it back into hyperspace permanently," Sarah finished. "But how do we attack something like that with primitive technology?" Voss smiled, and for the first time since they had met, Sarah saw something resembling the old Andromedan confidence. "Captain, your species has something that mine has forgotten through millennia of technological dependence. You still remember how to improvise, how to create solutions from nothing but determination and crude materials. What your people call thinking outside the box might be exactly what this situation requires." Sarah felt a surge of hope. Throughout human history, their species had survived by being adaptable, stubborn, and creative in the face of impossible odds. Now those same qualities might be the key to saving not just humanity, but all life in the galaxy. "Commander Voss, would you and your people be willing to work with us? Your knowledge of the entity combined with human adaptability might give us a chance." Voss extended his hand in the human gesture of agreement, something no Andromedan had ever done before. Captain Chen, it would be our honor. For the first time in centuries, my people have something to learn from yours. As the two commanders shook hands on the surface of an alien world, surrounded by the wreckage of galactic civilization's most advanced technology, a new alliance was born. The galaxy's most primitive spacefaring race and its most technologically advanced survivors would join forces to face a nightmare that threatened to unmake reality itself. The improvised war room aboard the UES Defiance looked nothing like the sophisticated command centers that usually coordinated galactic military operations. Paper charts covered every available surface held down by coffee cups and simple metal weights. Andromedan survivors worked alongside human crew members, using pencils and basic mathematical instruments to calculate trajectories and energy patterns that would normally require quantum computers. Captain Sarah Chen stood before a large paper map of the local galactic sector, studying the red marks that indicated systems already consumed by the entity. The pattern was becoming clear and it terrified her. "It's moving faster now," Dr. Webb observed, looking up from his handwritten calculations. The entity consumed the Zephyrian home system in half the time it took to cleanse this research station. Commander Voss, now wearing human-made clothing salvaged from the ship's stores, nodded grimly. The entity learns from each encounter. It becomes more efficient at identifying and eliminating technological complexity. By the time it reaches Earth, it may be able to strip away your civilization's technology in a matter of hours. Sarah traced the projected path on the chart with her finger. According to their calculations, the entity would reach the outer human colonies within 6 days. Earth itself had perhaps 2 weeks before the galaxy's ultimate nightmare arrived at humanity's doorstep. "Commander Jackson, what's our status on the evacuation plans?" Sarah asked. The Marine commander consulted his handwritten notes. "We've managed to contact 17 human colony worlds using basic radio transmissions. Most are implementing emergency protocols, moving populations to agricultural settlements and abandoning major cities. But Captain, we're talking about billions of people, trying to survive with pre-industrial technology." Dr. Webb looked up from where he was working with Andromedan scientist Kethvar on understanding the entity's dimensional properties. "Captain, Kethvar and I have been analyzing the entity's behavior patterns. We believe we've found something significant." The elderly Andromedan scientist, his neural ports now crudely sealed with medical tape, spoke in careful English. "The entity appears to have a specific resonance frequency that maintains its connection between normal space and hyperspace. If we could generate an interference pattern at exactly the right frequency, we might be able to disrupt that connection." "That's great news," Sarah said. "What do we need to build such a device?" Kethvar and Dr. Webb exchanged glances before Webb answered. "That's the problem, Captain. The calculations show that we need to generate a very specific type of quantum interference. Normally, this would require technology far beyond what humans possess. But because the entity destroys advanced technology, we can't use any sophisticated equipment." Sarah felt her hope beginning to fade. It seemed like every potential solution led back to the same impossible problem. "However," Voss interjected, "we have discovered something interesting about human technology that might provide an answer." He gestured to one of the Andromedan technicians, who brought forward what appeared to be a collection of primitive electronic components. "Your species has a unique approach to technology that we had always dismissed as crude and inefficient. You use brute force solutions where we use elegant quantum manipulation. You build with solid matter where we use exotic materials. But this crude approach may be exactly what we need." Dr. Webb leaned forward with interest. "Explain." "Human radio technology, for example, generates electromagnetic radiation through simple electron movement in metallic conductors. It is so primitive that the entity barely recognizes it as technology at all. But if we could amplify such a signal to massive levels," Sarah began to understand. "You're talking about building a giant radio transmitter that can generate the interference frequency you need?" "Precisely," Kethvar confirmed. "But not just any radio transmitter. We would need to create the largest and most powerful transmission array ever constructed, using only materials and techniques that the entity would consider too primitive to threaten." Commander Jackson studied the schematics that were taking shape on paper. "How large are we talking about?" Voss pulled out a rough sketch he had been working on. The antenna array would need to span several hundred kilometers to generate sufficient power. We would need thousands of transmitters working in perfect synchronization, all powered by the most basic energy sources available. Sarah stared at the plans with a mixture of amazement and dismay. Commander, you're describing a project that would normally take years to complete with modern construction equipment. We have less than 2 weeks. Which is why we need to do something that no civilization in galactic history has ever attempted. Voss replied. We need to mobilize every human world, every ship, every person who can hold a tool or weld a joint. This cannot be a military operation or a corporate project. It must be the combined effort of your entire species. Dr. Webb was frantically scribbling calculations. Captain, if we use asteroid mining operations to provide raw materials, orbital shipyards for large-scale construction, and every available transport ship to move components. He paused, checking his math. It might actually be possible. Sarah felt the weight of command pressing down on her shoulders. She was being asked to coordinate the largest construction project in human history, using primitive technology, in less time than it normally took to build a single starship. What about power? Jackson asked. An array that size would require enormous amounts of energy. Kethvar smiled, an expression that looked strange on his alien features. That, Commander, is where human stubbornness becomes an advantage. Your fusion reactors are crude by our standards, but they are also remarkably robust. The entity has difficulty affecting technology that operates through simple nuclear fusion, rather than exotic matter manipulation. Sarah made her decision. Start drafting messages to every human world, every ship captain, every industrial facility in our space. Tell them what we're facing and what we need to do. Use basic radio transmissions only, no quantum communication networks. She turned to address the entire room. We're going to build something that will either save galactic civilization or represent humanity's last act of defiance. Either way, we're going to show the galaxy what humans can accomplish when their backs are against the wall. As the crew began drafting messages and refining plans, Sarah looked out at the stars through the viewport. Somewhere out there, an entity beyond human comprehension was methodically destroying everything that represented advanced civilization. But humanity had faced extinction before, and they had always found a way to survive through determination, creativity, and the willingness to attempt the impossible. The greatest construction project in human history was about to begin, and the clock was already ticking. The asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter had been transformed into the largest construction site in human history. Where once only automated mining drones had operated, now thousands of ships worked around the clock to build humanity's desperate gamble against extinction. Captain Sarah Chen stood on the observation deck of the construction platform Prometheus, watching as cargo haulers the size of city blocks maneuvered massive transmitter components into position. The sight would have been impossible just 2 weeks ago. But the threat of galactic annihilation had motivated humanity to achieve what many had thought impossible. Captain, we're receiving status reports from all construction sectors. Lieutenant Rodriguez called out from his temporary communication station. The entire operation was being coordinated using basic radio transmissions, creating a constant chatter of voices across multiple frequencies. Give me the summary, Sarah replied, not taking her eyes off the construction activities outside. Sectors 1 through 15 are reporting antenna arrays at 85% completion. Power distribution networks are at 90%. The main transmission control center is finished and undergoing final testing. Dr. Webb approached with a datapad containing handwritten calculations. Captain, the energy requirements are proving even higher than we initially estimated. We're going to need every fusion reactor in human space operating at maximum output to power the array. Sarah nodded grimly. They had already stripped power systems from non-essential facilities across dozens of worlds. Entire cities were operating on backup power while their main reactors were dismantled and transported to the asteroid belt. What about the synchronization systems? Sarah asked. That's where things get interesting, Webb replied with a tired smile. Kethvar and his team have developed a timing system using mechanical clockwork mechanisms. It's incredibly primitive by galactic standards, but it's also completely immune to the entity's effects. Commander Voss floated over from where he had been consulting with human engineers. The Andromedan had adapted surprisingly well to working in zero gravity using only magnetic boots and safety tethers. Captain Chen, I must express my amazement at what your species has accomplished, Voss said. When we first proposed this project, I calculated a 30% chance of success. Now I believe we may actually have a working transmission array within the next 18 hours. Any word on the entity's current position? Sarah asked. The latest reports place it at the Rigel system, Voss replied. It consumed the Crystalline Collective's primary research facility in less than 6 hours. The entity's efficiency continues to improve with each encounter. Sarah felt a chill despite the warmth of the construction platform's atmosphere. Rigel was only 3 jumps away from Earth. At the entity's current rate of advancement, they had perhaps 36 hours before it arrived at humanity's home system. Captain, incoming priority transmission from Admiral Harrison, Rodriguez announced. Put him through. The elderly admiral's voice crackled through the basic speakers, carrying the weight of command across the void. Captain Chen, I'm sure you're aware of our time constraints. The entity has just finished with the Rigel system and appears to be heading directly for Earth. How long until your array is operational? 18 hours for construction completion, Admiral. But we still need to calibrate the transmission frequency and coordinate power distribution across the entire array. That's cutting it very close, Captain. What's your confidence level? Sarah looked around at the controlled chaos of the construction site. Human workers and Andromedan scientists were laboring side by side, using tools and techniques that would have been familiar to engineers from centuries past. Yet somehow they were building something that no advanced civilization had ever attempted. Admiral, I've never been more proud of what humanity can accomplish when we set our minds to it. We'll be ready. I hope so, Captain, for all our sakes. The transmission ended, leaving Sarah alone with her thoughts. Through the observation windows, she could see the massive antenna array taking shape. Hundreds of kilometers of metallic structures stretched across the asteroid belt. Supported by a framework that had been welded together by thousands of individual workers using the most basic tools available. Dr. Webb approached with Kethvar close behind. Both scientists looked exhausted but determined. Captain, we've completed the final calculations for the interference frequency, Webb announced. But there's something else we need to discuss. What is it? Kethvar spoke carefully, his English having improved dramatically over the past 2 weeks. The energy requirements for the transmission will overload most of our power systems. We estimate that 70% of the fusion reactors powering the array will suffer catastrophic failure during the transmission sequence. Sarah felt her stomach drop. Are you saying this is a one-shot weapon? Worse than that, Webb replied. The electromagnetic pulse generated by the failing reactors will likely destroy most electronic systems within a 100-kilometer radius. Any ships or stations in the area will be completely disabled. Sarah understood the implications immediately. Success or failure, the largest construction project in human history would destroy itself in the process of firing. Worse, any human personnel who remained in the area would be stranded in space with no hope of rescue. How many people are we talking about? Sarah asked quietly. Approximately 12,000 workers across all construction platforms, Webb replied, plus the crews of the ships providing power and structural support. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the full weight of command settle on her shoulders. She was being asked to sacrifice thousands of lives for a chance to save billions. Captain, Voss said softly, there is another consideration. If the transmission fails to stop the entity, it will learn from our attack. It will become immune to this type of interference, and no future attempts will be possible. So we have one chance to get this right, Sarah said. Yes, and if we fail, the entity will continue its path through the galaxy until every trace of advanced technology has been eliminated from existence. Sarah looked out at the thousands of workers, laboring to complete humanity's desperate gamble. They were ordinary people, miners, engineers, technicians, ship crew members, who had volunteered to build something that might save civilization itself. Most of them probably understood that they were unlikely to survive the attempt. Announce general quarters, Sarah ordered. All non-essential personnel are to evacuate to minimum safe distance. Essential crew members will remain to operate the array. Captain, Rodriguez said quietly, that includes most of the senior staff. Someone needs to stay behind to coordinate the final transmission sequence. Sarah nodded, having already made that calculation herself. Prepare the evacuation shuttles. We're going to give the galaxy's ultimate nightmare something it's never encountered before: human determination backed by the willingness to sacrifice everything for a chance at victory. As evacuation alarms began to sound throughout the construction site, Sarah took one last look at the massive transmitter array. In less than 18 hours, they would either achieve the impossible or die trying. For humanity, those had always been acceptable odds. The control room of the massive transmitter array was a study in controlled chaos. Banks of primitive electronic equipment lined the walls, their analog displays and mechanical switches a stark contrast to the sophisticated technology that normally governed such operations. Captain Sarah Chen stood before the main control panel, her hands steady despite the magnitude of what they were about to attempt. Entity detected at the edge of the solar system, Dr. Webb reported from his monitoring station. It's moving directly toward Earth just as we predicted. Through the observation windows, the massive antenna array stretched across the asteroid belt like a metallic web designed to catch nightmares. 300 kilometers of carefully positioned transmitters awaited the signal that would either save galactic civilization or represent humanity's final act of defiance. Power systems report ready, called Chief Engineer Martinez from the reactor control station. All fusion plants are operating at maximum output. We're generating more energy than has ever been concentrated in one location in human history. Commander Voss floated near the main display, his alien features tense with concentration. Despite the evacuation orders, he had insisted on remaining to help coordinate the transmission sequence. His knowledge of the entity's dimensional properties was too valuable to lose. Captain, synchronization checks are complete, Lieutenant Rodriguez announced. All transmitter arrays are locked to the master timing sequence. Mechanical clockwork systems are functioning within acceptable parameters. Sarah looked around at the skeleton crew that had volunteered to remain behind. 53 humans and 7 Andromedans. Operating equipment that would have been considered primitive by the standards of the previous century, yet somehow they had built something that represented the cutting edge of anti-dimensional warfare. Visual confirmation of the entity, Dr. Webb called out, his voice tight with tension. On the main viewing screen, fed by a simple optical telescope, they could see it. The entity defied description in any language, appearing as a region of space where reality itself seemed to be unraveling. Stars dimmed and flickered as it passed, their light becoming confused about which direction it should travel. Space itself seemed to ripple around the entity like water disturbed by an invisible stone. It's larger than our projections suggested, Voss observed. The dimensional distortion extends for several million kilometers in all directions. Will the array still be effective at that scale? Sarah asked. Unknown, Webb replied honestly. We're operating in completely theoretical territory here. As they watched, the entity passed through the outer solar system. Where it traveled, the sophisticated monitoring stations that humanity had built over the decades simply ceased to function. The automated mining platforms around Neptune forgot how to extract resources from the ice and rock. Communication satellites spanning the system went silent as their quantum processors became unable to process information. Captain, we're losing contact with the outer colonies, Rodriguez reported. The entity's influence is spreading faster than we anticipated. Sarah gripped the control panel tighter. They had known this was a possibility. The entity's power seemed to grow with each system it consumed, and now it was feeding on the technology of humanity's most advanced installations. Mars colony reports total system failure, came another report. All advanced technology has gone offline. The colonists are falling back to emergency protocols. How long until it reaches Earth? Sarah asked. At current velocity, approximately 4 hours, Webb calculated. But Captain, if we wait for it to get closer, the entity's influence might disable our own equipment. Sarah faced the most crucial decision of her career. Fire too early and they might miss their target entirely. Wait too long, and their primitive transmitter array might be affected by the entity's power to unmake technology. Kethvar, what's your assessment? Sarah asked the Andromedan scientist. The entity's dimensional resonance is becoming stronger as it approaches areas with higher technological density, Kethvar replied. If we wait for it to reach Earth, our transmission may not be powerful enough to disrupt its connection to hyperspace. But if we fire now and miss, Voss began. We don't get a second chance, Sarah finished. I know. She looked around at her crew one more time. These people had volunteered to remain behind, knowing that the power surge from the transmission would likely destroy every piece of equipment on the platform, including life support systems. They were gambling their lives on a single shot at an impossible target. Begin final targeting sequence, Sarah ordered. The control room filled with the sound of mechanical calculators clicking as the crew worked to determine the exact transmission coordinates. Without computers, they were relying on slide rules, paper charts, and human intuition to aim their weapon at a target that existed partially outside normal space. Targeting solution locked, Chief Martinez announced. All transmitter arrays are aligned and ready. Power systems at maximum, came another report. Mechanical timing systems synchronized. Rodriguez confirmed. Sarah placed her hand on the master firing control, a simple mechanical switch that would send the activation signal to thousands of transmitters scattered across the asteroid. Belt, this is for everyone who ever looked up at the stars and dreamed of something better, Sarah said quietly. For every civilization that ever dared to reach beyond their home world. For the future of intelligence in this galaxy. She looked at the viewing screen one more time. The entity was clearly visible now. A wound in reality itself that was spreading toward the cradle of human civilization. All stations report ready, Dr. Webb announced. Sarah took a deep breath and activated the firing sequence. Across the asteroid belt, thousands of primitive radio transmitters came to life simultaneously. The carefully calculated interference pattern began to propagate through space at the speed of light, carrying with it the combined hopes and desperation of an entire species. The power surge was immediate and catastrophic. Fusion reactors throughout the array began to overload as they channeled more energy than they were designed to handle. Explosions bloomed like deadly flowers across the construction site as power systems failed in cascading sequences. But the transmission continued, powered by the determination of people who refused to accept defeat, even in the face of cosmic horror. On the viewing screen, they watched as their invisible weapon reached its target. For a moment, nothing seemed to happen. Then reality itself began to shudder around the entity, as the interference pattern disrupted its connection between normal space and hyperspace. The entity convulsed, its form becoming unstable as it lost its grip on the dimensional framework that allowed it to exist in normal space. Stars around it began to shine clearly again as space-time reasserted its natural configuration. Then, with a distortion that made the viewing screen flicker, the entity collapsed back into hyperspace, banished from normal reality by the galaxy's most primitive weapons wielded by its most stubborn defenders. Direct hit, Dr. Webb announced, his voice filled with amazement. The entity's dimensional signature has completely disappeared from normal space. The control room erupted in cheers, but Sarah knew their celebration would be brief. Around them, the massive transmitter array was tearing itself apart, and their platform's life support systems were beginning to fail. They had won the battle, but now they faced the question of whether anyone would survive to tell the tale. Captain Sarah Chen floated in the damaged control room, her breath visible in the rapidly cooling air as the platform's life support systems failed one by one. Around her, the surviving crew members worked frantically to restore basic life support, using nothing but emergency equipment and stubborn determination. Emergency power restored to Section C, Chief Engineer Martinez called out, his voice echoing strangely in the thin atmosphere. We've got maybe 6 hours of air recycling, but the heating systems are completely offline. Through the observation windows, the aftermath of their desperate gamble was clearly visible. The massive transmitter array that had taken 2 weeks to build was now a field of twisted metal and debris, slowly expanding as the destroyed components drifted apart under their own momentum. Fusion reactors that had been pushed beyond their design limits continued to vent plasma into space, creating a light show that would be visible from Earth. Captain, I'm receiving transmissions from the evacuation fleet, Lieutenant Rodriguez announced from his jury-rigged communication station. Admiral Harrison is requesting immediate status report. Tell him the entity has been successfully banished to hyperspace, Sarah replied. The immediate threat to Earth and the galaxy has been eliminated. Dr. Webb looked up from where he was monitoring the few remaining sensors that still functioned. Captain, long-range scans confirm that the entity's dimensional signature has completely disappeared from normal space. Whatever we did, it worked. The interference pattern successfully disrupted its ability to maintain coherent existence in our reality. Commander Voss, who had been quietly working at a manual calculation station, approached with a sheet of paper covered in equations. Captain Chen, I have been analyzing the energy readings from our transmission. The interference pattern we generated should remain stable in hyperspace for several thousand years. Even if the entity eventually recovers, it will be unable to return to normal space for a very long time. Sarah felt a surge of relief mixed with exhaustion. They had actually done it. Using nothing but primitive technology and human determination, they had defeated an enemy that had destroyed civilizations far more advanced than their own. "Captain, incoming transmission from Earth," Rodriguez announced. "It's Admiral Harrison, and he says it's urgent. Put him through." Admiral Harrison's voice crackled through the basic speakers, carrying with it the weight of command and the relief of survival. "Captain Chen, I want you to know that your actions have saved not just humanity, but every intelligent species in the galaxy. We've received confirmation from Andromedan, Zephyrian, and Crystalline collective territories. The entity's effects are reversing. Technology that was previously disabled is beginning to function again." Sarah looked around at her crew, all of whom were listening to the transmission despite their desperate situation. "That's excellent news, Admiral. But we have a more immediate problem. The platform's life support systems are failing, and we have maybe 6 hours of breathable air remaining." "Understood, Captain. The evacuation fleet is already moving to your position, but they won't arrive for another 8 hours. Can you hold out that long?" Sarah looked at Chief Martinez, who shook his head grimly. "Negative, Admiral. We're going to be cutting it very close." "Captain," Voss interrupted, "there may be a solution. The Andromedan shuttle we used to reach your ship is still docked in Bay 7. Its life support systems are completely independent and should be sufficient to sustain our group until rescue arrives." Sarah nodded. "All personnel, prepare for evacuation to the Andromedan shuttle. Take only essential survival equipment." As the crew began gathering their few possessions, Dr. Webb approached Sarah with a thoughtful expression. "Captain, I've been thinking about what we've accomplished here. For the first time in galactic history, the most primitive spacefaring civilization has saved the most advanced ones. This is going to change everything about how species relate to each other in this galaxy." Sarah understood what he meant. For centuries, humanity had been treated as the galactic equivalent of barbarians who had stumbled into space travel through luck rather than skill. Now, those same barbarians had proven that sometimes primitive solutions were the most effective ones. "Captain Chen," Kethvar said as they prepared to abandon the control room, "I want you to know that my people will never forget what humanity has done. The Andromedan Collective owes you a debt that can never be repaid." "Commander Voss has already repaid any debt by working alongside us," Sarah replied. "What we accomplished here was only possible because your people were willing to share their knowledge with ours." As they made their way through the damaged corridors toward the shuttle bay, Sarah reflected on the events of the past few weeks. Humanity had faced extinction and responded not with panic or despair, but with the same stubborn creativity that had carried their species from the caves of Earth to the stars themselves. The Andromedan shuttle was cramped with 53 humans and 7 aliens aboard, but it was warm and filled with breathable air. As they waited for rescue, Sarah looked out at the debris field that had once been humanity's greatest construction project. "Captain," Rodriguez said from the shuttle's communication station, "I'm receiving reports from across human space. The colonies that survived the entity's approach are celebrating. They're calling this the greatest victory in human history." "And they're right," Dr. Webb added. "We didn't just defeat an impossible enemy. We proved that intelligence and determination are more powerful than any advanced technology." Commander Voss floated near the viewport, studying the wreckage with what might have been admiration. "Captain Chen, when my people first encountered humanity, we saw only a species that used brute force where we used elegance, solid matter where we used exotic energy. We thought you were primitive." He turned to face Sarah directly. "Now I understand that what we saw as primitiveness was actually strength. You build things that last. You solve problems that would paralyze more sophisticated minds. You refuse to accept defeat even when facing impossible odds." Sarah smiled tiredly. "Commander, I think this experience has taught both our species something important. Advanced technology is a tool, but it's not the only tool. Sometimes the simplest solutions are the most effective ones." 8 hours later, the evacuation fleet arrived to find 53 humans and 7 Andromedans alive and well aboard a shuttle that had become the most famous vessel in galactic history. As they were transferred to the rescue ships, Sarah took one last look at the asteroid belt where humanity had built and sacrificed its greatest achievement. The debris would drift there for centuries, a monument to the day when the galaxy's most primitive spacefaring species stood against cosmic horror and refused to yield. It would serve as a reminder that in a universe full of wonders and terrors, sometimes the most important quality was not technological sophistication, but the simple refusal to give up. Humanity had faced the galaxy's ultimate nightmare and emerged, victorious not through superior firepower or advanced science, but through the same stubborn determination that had carried them from their home planet to the stars. The galaxy would never underestimate the power of human ingenuity again. As the rescue fleet jumped to hyperspace, carrying the survivors back toward Earth, Sarah knew that this was not an ending, but a beginning. Humanity had proven themselves to the galactic community in the most dramatic way possible, and the relationships between species would never be the same again. The galaxy's ultimate nightmare was over, but humanity's greatest adventure was just beginning.